Who controls history? The men on the battlefield, or the men who move the money? Across more than 2 centuries, the House of Rothschild constructed one of the most influential financial networks in Europe, shaping sovereign debt and war finance from Frankfurt to London and Paris. They did not sit on thrones, but they financed them. In the era defined by empires, that distinction was decisive. The story begins in the 18th century, in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. Like many Jews of his time, Mayer Amschel Rothschild was barred from owning land, entering most trades, or participating fully in civic life. As a result, he followed the limited commercial paths available to him and began working as a trader in textiles and small goods. The conditions of the ghetto were restrictive, but they also shaped a particular kind of commercial awareness. Trade required negotiation, mobility, and constant calculation of margins. However, textile trading offered limited scalability. The margins were thin, competition was constant, and growth was constrained by regulation. So Mayer shifted his focus. He moved into trading rare coins and antiques, markets with higher value, fewer participants, and greater asymmetry of information. Mayer eventually became a court agent to Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe at the time. When the prince wished to purchase gold coins or other financial instruments, he relied on Rothschild to acquire them from the market. What Rothschild did was structurally simple. He first purchased the coins using borrowed capital. He then resold them to the prince at a markup, while also collecting a commission for arranging the transaction. In modern financial terminology, this resembles what is known as front-running, acting ahead of a client's order to secure a pricing advantage. The result was dual profit, a commission fee and a trading margin. There was nothing mystical about the process. It was information, timing, and positioning. By the early 1780s, Mayer Amschel Rothschild had accumulated significant capital and secured control over managing portions of the prince's wealth. But wealth alone was not the objective. Institutional permanence was. Managing the fortune of a prince secured influence. It provided capital. It brought recognition. However, it did not guarantee permanence. To ensure long-term stability, his operations had to evolve beyond brokerage and court agency. To gain legitimacy in the financial world of late 18th century Europe, he had to become something more enduring. He had to become a banker. By the close of the 1700s, he was already the wealthiest man in Frankfurt. Yet status within a city was not the same as structural power across borders. To truly establish a lasting financial house, expansion would be necessary. And expansion required coordination. Mayer Rothschild had 5 sons. He did not keep them in Frankfurt. Instead, he positioned them in the major capitals of Europe. Amschel remained in Frankfurt. Solomon went to Vienna. Nathan was sent to London. Karl established operations in Naples. James built the Paris branch. Each city was a financial node. Each son represented a branch of the same house. Communication moved between them through private correspondence and trusted couriers. Information traveled faster within the family than it did between governments. The result was not 5 separate banks. It was one coordinated network operating across borders, currencies, and political systems. But Europe was entering an era of prolonged conflict, and every financial house would soon be tested. In London, that test would fall on Nathan. He arrived with £20,000 provided by his father. The British textile industry was expanding rapidly, driven by industrial production and overseas demand. Nathan understood that profit rarely sits in a single transaction. There were 3 profits: the raw material, the dyeing, and the manufacturing. Instead of operating at one stage, he positioned himself across several. He supplied materials and dye, secured manufacturing, and controlled distribution. In a short time, £20,000 became £60,000. The capital had tripled. By 1808, his reported sales had reached approximately £800,000, reflecting the scale at which his operations had expanded within only a few years. To ensure consistent revenue, Nathan also moved beyond conventional trade routes, engaging in the discrete movement of textiles and precious metals across the Channel at a time when formal restrictions and wartime disruptions made such transfers highly profitable. That growth provided liquidity. Liquidity provided leverage, and leverage positioned him for something larger than textiles. By the early 1800s, as Nathan's commercial network expanded beyond textiles and discrete cross-channel transfers, Europe was at war. To start a war, a government needs money. To sustain a war, it needs access to currency beyond its own borders. If it loses, it must compensate the victor. Military campaigns required gold, bills of exchange, and secure transport routes, particularly at a time of fiscal overstretch when Britain was financing prolonged operations against Napoleonic France. When the Duke of Wellington required large quantities of bullion to finance operations on the continent, Nathan acquired approximately £800,000 worth of gold from the East India Company and undertook the responsibility of arranging its transfer to Portugal and onward into France. The government possessed the gold, but it lacked the mechanism to move it efficiently across wartime Europe. Nathan provided that mechanism. He later described it as the best business I ever did. Textiles had multiplied capital. War multiplied influence. Yet commissions and bullion transfers were only part of the equation. The greater advantage lay in coordination. Messages moved between London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples through private couriers and trusted agents. Markets reacted slowly. The Rothschild network reacted faster. In financial systems, price follows information, and information travels at a speed determined by infrastructure. The family built its own. They did not simply exchange currency, they positioned ahead of demand. In an era before telegraphs and central banks, anticipation carried measurable value. Information was capital. But when capital moves faster than governments, it reshapes the balance between them. And by the mid-19th century, that balance was beginning to shift again. While the Rothschild network remained dominant across European capitals, a new financial force was consolidating power in the United States. Its methods were familiar: government bonds, war finance, industrial consolidation. However, its structure was different. Where the Rothschilds operated through a decentralized family network across borders, the House of Morgan was increasingly centralized, rooted in New York. Junius Morgan, who had taken control of George Peabody and Company after Peabody's retirement, understood what the Rothschilds had demonstrated decades earlier. Sovereign finance defines scale. If a government can tax, it can repay. If it can repay, it can borrow. During the Franco-Prussian War, as tensions escalated between Napoleon III and Otto von Bismarck, many established European houses hesitated to extend credit to France amid expectations of military defeat. Morgan evaluated the situation differently. Through his syndicate, he raised over £10 million for the French government and facilitated access to American arms purchases, recognizing that, despite political instability, France maintained a diversified economy and an efficient tax collection system capable of servicing its obligations. The war ended in French defeat. The bonds were repaid ahead of schedule. The profit significantly increased the capital base of the Morgan firm and elevated it into the highest tier of government finance. While European empires continued to rely on established banking dynasties, America's industrial expansion, railroads, steel, and oil, was accelerating. And as economic gravity moved westward, so too did financial power. In May 1893, after years of railroad overexpansion and speculative financing, the American economy began to unravel. Banks failed, markets contracted, confidence evaporated. The federal government's gold reserves were declining. They were not merely low, they were approaching a critical threshold. Under the gold standard, the credibility of the United States depended on its ability to convert dollars into gold on demand. If reserves fell too far, the consequences would not be abstract. The outcome would be systemic. By early 1895, the Treasury was dangerously low on gold. Confidence in the dollar was eroding. Investors were withdrawing capital. The credibility of the young industrial power was at stake. The government was days away from breaching the minimum reserve required to maintain convertibility. A suspension of gold payments would have signaled financial weakness. The repercussions would have been global. At that moment, the balance between government authority and private capital narrowed to a single question: who controlled the gold? The federal government turned to private capital. J.P. Morgan understood the consequences of inaction, and he knew there was one family with access to substantial gold reserves: the Rothschilds. To raise $65 million, Morgan issued government bonds and negotiated the purchase of 3.5 million ounces of gold from the Rothschild network. The bonds sold quickly, and as gold entered the Treasury, pressure on federal reserves eased. Although the crisis did not disappear immediately, the intervention prevented a suspension of gold payments that could have damaged the credibility of the United States in international markets. For the second time in modern financial history, private capital had stabilized a sovereign government. But unlike in Europe, this coordination was centered in New York rather than London. The shift happened gradually, yet by the time Europe was moving toward war once again, the balance of financial power had already begun to tilt. When German forces entered Paris in 1940, the French branch of the Rothschild family faced immediate risk under the new occupation authorities. Several senior members, including Edouard, Robert, and Maurice de Rothschild, left France and eventually relocated to England or the United States. In territories under German control, properties were confiscated and financial holdings were restricted under wartime regulations. The displacement was not temporary in nature, as the restructuring of ownership and the seizure of assets altered the operational foundations of several European branches. During this period, preservation required relocation, and continuity depended less on expansion than on survival within jurisdictions that remained outside Axis control. After the Second World War, the Rothschild banking houses did not immediately return to their pre-war structure. The European branches had been weakened by asset seizures, political restructuring, and the broader decline of the old imperial order. In London, N.M. Rothschild and Sons assumed a central role in rebuilding continuity. Rather than pursuing rapid expansion, the firm maintained its traditional focus on government financing and advisory work, emphasizing long-standing relationships over public visibility. The post-war period transformed global banking. Larger institutions consolidated, financial markets modernized, new instruments and regulatory frameworks reshaped the industry. Yet key parts of the Rothschild network remained privately held. Internal control was prioritized over scale. The era of imperial war finance had passed. Today, that presence is less centralized and far less visible than in the 19th century, yet it continues through institutions such as Rothschild and Company and affiliated family holdings operating across investment banking, advisory services, wealth management, and private markets. The structure no longer resembles the original five-city network that once linked Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, but the principle of cross-border finance, advising governments, structuring capital, and managing long-term assets, remains consistent with its historical foundations. Unlike many global financial institutions that expanded through public listings and aggressive consolidation, significant parts of the Rothschild businesses have retained private ownership, preserving continuity of governance even as the scale of global banking has grown beyond any single family's dominance. Their influence today is measured less by sovereign war loans and more by advisory mandates, corporate restructurings, asset management, and long-term capital allocation within a highly regulated and interconnected global system. The era that defined their rise has ended. The structure that allowed their survival has not.